Hello, this is the Overtones Podcast, a show about the beauty of diversity within Christianity today. I'm Joe, and I'm a church worker.
I'm Christy, and I'm a church historian.
And I'm LaRae. I'm a Christian teacher. On our show, we talk to academics, professionals, and full-time church workers to explore lesser-heard voices that are shaping the church today.
I think if you look into the foreign press or how international media cover Taiwan, recently they focus mainly on the semiconductor ability of Taiwan because 90% of the high-tech, high-end semiconductor were manufactured in Taiwan. And so, so your iPhone, your electric vehicle, all the high-tech devices you have is probably some part of them is from Taiwan. So now a lot of people are suggesting that if China really did conquer Taiwan and invade Taiwan, a lot of people, they worry that first, this high-tech technology will be possessed by the Chinese Communist Party, by the authoritarian regime. And also, so that's the reason why some of the politicians, they are calling for this clean 5G network or clean supply chain. So basically hoping that the supply chain won't be controlled by any authoritarian regime. And the second perspective is the strategic location of Taiwan. So Taiwan is at the middle of the first island chain. The first island chain is composed by Japan, Taiwan, and Philippines. So basically, if you link this three countries all together, you will see it basically block China's east coast. So there's a lot of people, especially the US politician or people from the DOD, they will call Taiwan as the unsinkable aircraft carrier because Taiwan is like island, like blocking the first island chain. And why first island chain? Why Taiwan is so important geopolitically is because if you look into the east coast of Taiwan, it's a very steep cliff. It's amazingly beautiful, but it's a cliff. And the cliff is so deep that when you have a submarine diving into the water, it can like disappear from any radar or like basically undetectable. But if you look into the east coast of China, simply using your Google map and use the geographic view, and you will see the whole east coast of China. There's no place that allowed a submarine to go under so deep that being undetectable. So that's the reason why east coast of Taiwan is so important politically. And if you look at the first island chain, if you have a Pacific Ocean map, if Taiwan is being conquered by China, basically this first island chain it's broken. And China will have the ability to let their submarine to be undetectable. And the second island chain is basically U.S. territory, which Guam, and then is Hawaii. That is U.S. territory. So it is really important for U.S. if they wanted to maintain their hegemony in Asia Pacific. It is really important for them to safeguard the first island chain. And the third part of why Taiwan is so important internationally is because our system, our democratic system. Taiwan is a very vibrant democracy. Our like human rights score, I think, is even better than UK.
Oh, wow.
Woo!
Okay.
We are amazing.
So Taiwan is a very vibrant democracy. Even we do see some controversies, political controversies or turmoil in Taiwan, but still people in Taiwan do have very high like free speech and all these rights. So like when people see why we wanted to help Ukraine, it's because if the Europe allowed this authoritarianism to basically conquer a democracy through their strength, and if meaning that it's acceptable, right? So that's the reason why Taiwan's like-minded allies, democratic allies, wanted to help Taiwan to preserve this way of life, this democracy. And I think I will wanted to fight for this democracy, and that a lot of people die to build this system, and I will also wanted to fight for it.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Jasmine. Thank you to all of our listeners for joining us for another episode of the Overtones podcast. We're delighted to have Jasmine Lee with us today from the US-Taiwan Watch think tank. She's going to be sharing with us more about politics in Taiwan, Christian perspective on political engagement, and we're delighted to have her here today. So Jasmine, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to have you here. Could you tell us a little bit more about yourself, first of all? Who are you? What do you do? Let our listeners know a little bit more about you.
Of course. Hi, LaRae and Christy. I'm Jasmine. I'm currently based in Taiwan. I'm working as a analyst at a political advisory firm in Taiwan, and I also running a think tank called US-Taiwan. It's a think tank slash media, which focus on US-Taiwan relations, US-China-Taiwan relations with a few friends. Yeah, so that's me.
That's brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, amazing. Welcome, Jasmine. It's so exciting to get you here. For those of you who don't know, US-Taiwan Watch is pretty popular in Taiwan. So it's such a privilege to be able to get you on a podcast. I think a lot of our listeners are not Taiwanese. And I remember a friend of mine, whom shall not be named, she didn't even know where Taiwan is, which is unforgivable.
Aww.
Yeah, so I wonder, just in case people don't know anything about Taiwan, could you give us a bit of a basic information about what Taiwan is and where is Taiwan? All these kind of like basic things that Taiwanese know that we want, other people to know as well.
Yeah, so Taiwan is right next to China, the east side of China, and above us is Japan, where Christy is, and below is the Philippines. So you can see that we are very close to China. So our politics, our geopolitics, our history is also really related to China. So in the past 70 years that Taiwanese people, we do have an identity complex. Like a lot of people, they call themselves Chinese. And also after World War II, when the KMT party, Kuomintang party, which used to rule China, they flee to Taiwan. They have this education to educate people as Chinese. So like my father's generation, they will call themselves Chinese. And after running our own country and running this island for the past 70 years, now this Taiwanese identity has consolidated in Taiwan. So more than 80% of the people, they consider themselves as Taiwanese. Some of them will have dual identity, but most of them will still say they are Taiwanese. And I think for a lot of people, they see Taiwan from the news coverage. Like The Economist is suggesting that Taiwan is the most dangerous place on earth because China, they claim that Taiwan belongs to them. So that's the problem.
I think you have touched on this sense of crisis. And when we talk about the significance of Taiwan and the kind of geopolitics and US-China relations, I just wonder, because you've touched on this as obviously a point of conflict between two superpowers, China and the US. And there's been lots of news that talk about how Taiwan could be, as you said, the Economist, for example, that it could be the next war hotspot, following Ukraine and Gaza, obviously other places as well. And what's your take on this? Do you think there will be a war?
I think if we think there is, and it won't be. But if we think there won't be, there will be. The reason is because we think there will be, then we will start to prepare for it. And if we prepare for it and letting China to know the cost to conquer Taiwan is so high, China wouldn't do it. And because you have to understand that for China, for CPP, their army, their 解放军, the liberation army, the last time they've been on a war is in Korean War.
Okay.
Sure.
And comparing with the US has been in the war for multiple times in the past. So their troops are really well trained. And China knows that. And also if they wanted to show to the world their military capacity, they need to win this war, right?
Right.
So if Taiwan really wanted to prevent a war, we have to build up our military capacity. Letting China to know the cost is so high, or letting them think the possibility to win this war is so difficult, so they won't do it. So if people would think they won't be a war, then we stop preparing for it, it won't happen. Because when we are really weak, China will think, okay, it's really easy to conquer Taiwan. But if we think there is a war, there will be a war, and if we started to prepare for it, I believe it's the best way to prevent it from happening. And I believe that a lot of Taiwanese people, some people are really afraid of it, but I think the best attitude is that we concern but not fear. We don't want it to show to China that we're afraid of them. It's really interesting that on May 23rd and 24th, after the inauguration day of the new administration, China conduct a military drill, like surrounded Taiwan. Not much of people in Taiwan knows about that.
That's all, isn't it?
Wow, really?
Yeah, everybody's, the Google search coverage that day is mainly about Xing Yeyuan. It's a celebrity in
In Japan.
yeah, and he was involved in some affair, and people are all thinking about him. And also, like people in Taiwan, back on 23rd and 24th, there's also a congressional reform protest in Taiwan.
Yes, that was huge.
Yeah, and people are concentrating on that. So you will see that, like when China is trying to terrify Taiwan, and we have been like threatened by China for over 70 years. Life goes on, and we prepare for it. We do cares about it, but we're not going to let them to dictate our or manipulate our life. Like life so goes on.
It's something being quite interesting to see, kind of as a Taiwanese. I feel like I grew up feeling China is a big threat, and there are lots of things like this, like military drills is one thing. There are other things I think they say. They very often use kind of words of aggression towards us. But I don't know. Like, what do you think that is, Jasmine? Because I very often feel like if you want us to be friends, if you want Taiwanese to want to go back to China, you don't do this, right? You don't kind of use words of aggression. You will be you show love and care.
We both are very lucky. We grew up in a loving Christian family.
Oh, do you think that's why?
Our parents like love us and show their loves and like talks about how much they love us. But I know a lot of friends growing up in the more traditional Chinese family. They have to obey their parents and the kids. There's a hierarchy, right?
Right.
The kids have to listen to the parents all the time. A lot of my relatives in the older generation, and they educated under this Chinese education. They talks like CCP talks, how those CCP hawks talks, and they are like, if you don't listen to me, I will like hit your butt. They really will say this, and they will say, if you don't follow me, I will let you to something really, really rude.
Right.
That's how they've been educated. Yeah, so I think I wouldn't say it's okay, but that's how they've been educated. And I found one thing really interesting is that after China did the military drill on May 23rd and 24th, and the 7th Fleet of US. So 7th Fleet is located in the Okinawa, and they are mainly in charge of the stability of Asia Pacific. And 7th Fleet, on the day of the Chinese military drill, they post a photo on Facebook, photos of the soldiers on the ship, on the aircraft carrier doing yoga.
What?
And I think that is great. They are saying that we are watching you, but we are not being terrified.
That was very insightful, actually, because you're basically saying China. The Chinese government probably thinks it works if we can enforce discipline, and fear is a very useful tool. And we're thinking that if we can use aggression to make them obey us and want to be unified with us, that's where we're gonna do it. But for you and me, we're thinking surely that's not a very effective way of communication. But you're saying that might not be the way they think.
Yeah, but I think like China, they also need to communicate it to their own people, right? Because actually China's like military, their internal police system spending is actually always higher than their military spending, which meaning that they need to suppress their own people more than they want to spend on their military capacity. So when they are talking really rude to Taiwan, to a certain point, they are also talking to their own people, showing their people like, see, I'm being like, I'm doing my job, like punishing Taiwan. That's something they need to do for their people.
Right, the kind of patriotism that needs to be upheld as a value in China.
That's such a good point. Foreign relations and internal relations are always so intertwined, and it's very easy standing on the outside to kind of separate them. They really aren't. How a nation is interacting with other nations so often is about home politics.
So do you think, Jasmine, so you've mentioned that, the best way for us to prepare is to kind of be cautious, to think that there might be a war and then prepare ourselves. And I wonder, like, because Jasmine, you've been in Taiwan for a very long time, whereas I've been kind of like studying abroad and everything and working abroad. Do you think people in Taiwan are worried? And are they divided over these political issues, like their views of China, their views of the US? And how about Christians, for example? Is there like a comparison we can make between Taiwanese people in general and Taiwanese Christians, and whether they are divided over these issues?
Yeah, I actually don't see that much of differences between general Taiwanese people and like Christian in Taiwan. But I think it really depends on your own value and your own your background. And yes, I do see that some people they are really worried about it. And I found it really interesting that when Russian-Ukraine war happened, I saw a TV commentary show suggesting that, oh, Taiwan is so lucky, then we're luckier than Ukraine because we're surrounded by waters. So it will be harder for China to invade us. And I was like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And then I switched to
Yeah.
the other channel and they say Taiwan is so much less lucky because we are surrounded by water. And I was like, what? Because it will be harder for us to flee. And I was like,
Oh,
oh yeah, that's
Yes.
right.
I do think so. I mean, if there's going to be a war, we're all trapped on an island. There's nowhere to go.
Yeah, so I think there's two different kind of mindset. Yes, we do have a group of people they want to fight for their own country and they're willing to come out to fight. There are also the other group of people they wanted to flee. After the Russian-Ukraine war, if you look into the poll, this two group of people both increase. Meaning that it become even more partisan. I think I'm definitely the person that I'm willing to fight, and not because I think I'm a very privileged person, but at the same time, I understand those people they wanted to flee, so I will also respect them. And I think we are a democracy, so it is good to have different voices, and it is okay to have different voices. And with even we have different voices, we have to support each other and we have to continue to communicate. And I can understand, like, for example, my uncle, he wants to flee because my grandpa and his father has been in the war for a long time. And my grandpa has been telling him how terrible this war and you have to leave this place. So that's how he's being educated. So if I'm him, I'll probably make the same decision. So I think for Christian, for at least for me, I will remind myself that I need to understand why people think in different from me and trying to understand. And I also need to respect them. And it is okay that we are different.
You're right. I think even Christians in Taiwan are very divided. And the idea of, there are two major options, right? To fight and remain and fight or to flee. I can see how these two are the options that people have in mind. It's almost like we have only two choices. And to stay and fight sounds like suffering, given how small Taiwan is. And for me, it's like a principle in my life. I always avoid any forms of pain. And very brave of you to say you want to stay in Taiwan. And I think, when we are right there on the spot, when we are pushed to the corner, that could be the attitude that people come up with. We will have to kind of stay our ground and fight for what we believe in. And Christians are also kind of confronted with these different choices that, in a situation that's really not ideal.
You said that you don't see a huge difference between the general Taiwanese population, their perspective on China, kind of that it has these two main camps, and similarly among Christians. Just maybe backing up one step from the specific question of Chinese relations, do you see differences among Christians in terms of just political engagement in general, in terms of engagement in elections and public office and these sorts of questions? Yeah, I wonder if you could offer any reflections on that.
Yeah, my observation is that in church, people try to avoid talks about politics.
Okay.
There are a few churches, like Presbyterian churches, they are more involved in politics, but except for them and several others, most of the church, they don't want to talk about politics. And they avoid talking about it because sometimes they feel like it's going to like create more dispute within the church. And that's also happening in our education and school, in campus.
Really?
I think in Taiwan, politics is a little bit stigmatized. A lot of people think like politics is always nasty, is always evil, and like it's a really bad thing, people like trying to avoid talking about this. So I think that's the situation here. But I found it really interesting that whenever there's dispute, especially in church, the best way to stop the dispute is say, and let's pray. How about if you don't like this candidate, this politician, and you pray for him, you pray for her if you don't like her, and everybody will like, okay, fine. People, you cannot say
That's
no.
so
I'm not
good.
going to
Yes.
pray for him or her. So I think that's a good thing when we are having this dispute in church because we can have a really good call to action, and this action will stop the dispute and letting people go back home and to calm down and to really start to think and to like be humble in front of God and put this in front of God, letting him decide.
That's so good. That's such good advice and really important. It's so interesting to me because I grew up in America.
Yes.
I now have lived for 10 years in the UK, and the kind of relationship between religion and politics is so different in the two different places, at least in my experience. And I think I can relate to what you're saying very much in terms of the British context, where politics is very much not mentioned in church. And people kind of expect that people within the church will probably have different political views, and there's more of a separation there versus in America. And I think one reason for this is just there are so many denominations in America, so many churches. You really can kind of pick one that you absolutely agree with on everything to more of an extent than you could in the UK, where there are just fewer churches to kind of choose from. But that then means that there tends to be more, I think, unity within an individual church about a political idea, but then more conflict across the church as a whole, if that makes sense. But just, yeah, when we do find these conflicts, what do we do with them? They don't have to tear us apart. And I think that's so important, just that we take them to God, as we should with every conflict in our lives. That's really helpful.
This is actually something that is worth exploring, I think. On the one hand, we have evangelical Christianity in the US. Tim Keller I think he had an article on the New Yorker on the big E evangelicalism and the small e, and how these two are different, which I thought was very helpful. If we're going to go with the big E, with this kind of evangelicals as a political force, then you almost can hear them. They're very loud on TV. They are quite conservative politically. That's the impression, right? And then we have people who are not like that, especially in the UK, like LaRae has said, and in Taiwan. And then it's almost like, politics so sensitive, it's not appropriate to talk about it in church. It's not appropriate to kind of show your cards. It's almost a bit distasteful. But I wonder whether in both cases, there are things that we can learn from each other. Because surely Christians are supposed to have a biblical worldview.
Yes.
And when we have a biblical worldview, it challenges us to have a voice in this world that is different from other people who are not Christians. And surely there are times in the public sphere when people are discussing certain issues that are in some way directly relevant to our faith. And I think there are times when we are called to be a bit more vocal in the society that we live in. Why is it the case, LaRae, for example, that it seems that there's this big E evangelical group who have some form of consensus in politics? And why is it the case, Jasmine, in Taiwan, for example, that we generally avoid talking about politics? And do you think that should be the case? And do you think Christians in Taiwan should be encouraged to be a bit more vocal?
LaRae, do you want to say first?
You go ahead.
Yeah, so for the question on Taiwan, I would say that probably because of our culture and our education. So in the Chinese culture, we have a saying that it's 以和为贵, harmony is everything.
Yes.
Harmony is the most precious thing. In this Chinese culture, people will tend to pretend and to maintain a harmony, even though sometimes very superficial. It's just the image. It's not inside it, there's so many disputes. And when I went to US, I can see like people will say like, just talk about it and let's just resolve it. They just like, talk straight to it.
Right. More confrontational.
Yeah, they're more confrontation and I think there's pros and cons on this two very different culture. But when we have this kind of Chinese culture, like putting harmony as priority, like people will feel like let's not talk about politics right now. So I think that's one issue. And for second is our education. So the Taiwanese education or Chinese education, everybody is not encouraged to talk. Everybody is not encouraged to make a voice. Everybody is encouraged to just memorizing stuff, and you're not encouraged to have your own argument. Chinese culture is also it's not individualism, it's collectivism. So I think under this culture, this education, not just Christian, overall people in Taiwan, we are not encouraged to talk about our own view. So when Christianity, when Bible, when this faith came to this culture, it will also like blended with this culture, and you will see that like Chinese Christian, Taiwanese Christian, they follow more instead of like they having a question. And there's pros and cons. So you will see that the development of Taiwan or Chinese Christian history probably will be a little bit slower than in the West, or we are mainly sometimes we're the followers because we're less willing to like raise voice and provide our own arguments. But coming back to Christy's question, shall Taiwanese Christian be encouraged to raise our voice? Um, I think yes, but I will say for younger generation, because younger generation like me, I'm really lucky. My education encouraged me to raise my voice. Unlike my parents, and I feel like my parents or the older generation, they sometimes they wanted to say something, but they don't know how to because they are not trained to express what they want to say. So maybe I think for the context in Taiwan, I think younger generation, as we are trained and as we are more privileged to have more channels and more opportunity to raise our voice, maybe we can raise the voice and with the older generations together. We can help them, we can encourage them as well to together to do more for the society as Christian.
That's so insightful, Jasmine. Just really reflecting on the differences of the education system and how that shapes culture so deeply. And it kind of causes me to think back on my education and just on the history of America, which is just so different from that of Taiwan, but I think does give us some ideas of why there's this close connection between religion and politics, and what I think you've kind of pointed to, free speech, or the idea of each individual having something to offer and being encouraged to raise their voices. And it just causes me to reflect on the fact that from America's birth, religion was always very, very tightly connected with the politics. If you look at the sermons that were being preached around the time of the Revolution, and so many of the political documents, they all are trying to justify the actions of the founders and the rebels, whatever you want to call them, in scripture, and trying to set up a country in a way that is at least in some sense justified or based on biblical principles. Not saying they were all Christians necessarily, but that it always has been this understanding of religion and politics being very connected, and I think of quite a unique way. And I think my concerns with that is that sometimes the religion becomes subordinated to the politics, potentially. And so as a Christian, I would always want to keep things the right way around and keep the priorities. But I tend to think of this capital E evangelicals as something that's maybe just popped up in the last 10 or 20 years, but I don't actually think that's accurate. I think it's very much rooted in the history of the country.
That's a really good point. I think, like you said, like religion and politics is so intertwined in the history of America, not just America. Even before the English Protestants migrated to America, even before the US became the US, or, going back to the continent, to England, to the kind of early modern period, and even before that, religion and politics have always been forming a complex dynamic and kind of shaping each other. And I think, as LaRae, you very helpfully pointed out, there was religion and there were religious people wanting to engage in politics in honest and God-honoring way. But there are also a lot of people, perhaps more people, who just use religion for political gain. There was a lot of God talk, and regardless of how we're going to interpret the event, one of the most controversial TV moments of former President Donald Trump was him walking towards a church, right? It's the opposite of White House or whatever, holding out a Bible. And obviously that kind of sparked lots of controversies, lots of different interpretations of it. And it's not our responsibility and nor the intention of this podcast to actually comment on it. But that's just an example of how religion and politics are so, interconnected. And again, when we go back to evangelical Christianity as a belief system, then the history of this idea of holy peace, true peace, or using the word that you just used, Jasmine, 以和为贵, right? Harmony being the most important thing. That's a very Chinese virtue, isn't it? The collectivism, the idea that you have to have this social cohesion as a virtue. It's there in the history of the church, but it's carefully defined, so it's a bit different, isn't it? The idea of peace is grounded in scripture, is true peace. Which means, and a lot of people use that, including Puritan ministers, they talk about peace a lot. But what is true peace if it is not based on real values that the Bible teaches, then it's false peace. And then if that's the case, resisting this form of peace and pursuing conflict could actually be a more godly response. And I think at times in history, that's something Christians are called to contemplate on. And that's why the history of the church is very often history of a form of religious activism.
True.
Yeah, I'm not saying that we're not calling anyone to action here, but when thinking about Taiwanese Christians and the kind of overall silence that you told us about, Jasmine, maybe for us it is important to, rethink why we are so afraid of talking about politics in church and how we should respond to things that is literally on everyone's mind, China-US relations and the prospect of war and the fears and anxieties that people feel. Surely these are things that we can address in a more explicit way.
So Jasmine, I'm curious, you are a Christian who actively speaks out on political issues in Taiwan quite regularly. And I'm wondering, in the UK and in the US, we often have these stories of Christians who find serious conflicts between their faith and their politics, and sometimes there are success stories in how those are resolved and sometimes not. I wonder if you have had conflicts between your Christian values and your political participation that you've had to kind of navigate, and if you could share any of those with us.
Yeah, I want to say that probably we need to define what is politics. I think if there's people, there will be politics. And for me, I think politics is that how you find ways to resolve the differences between people. So, Jesus, he walks into the crowd. He served the people. So I think for Christian, we do have the responsibility to involve in politics. But when you involve in politics, you will definitely see something that you feel uncomfortable. But for me, I don't experience that much of conflict. I think I'm really lucky that my teaching in the church teach me to be humble. So that's when I see anything that I feel uncomfortable, I start to question. And I'll go back home and I'll think about it. When I take my question to God, I don't really see a conflict for myself. I don't see really a huge conflict. And I think the main thing that makes people uncomfortable is that when you see people are using Jesus' name to do something that you think it's probably not Jesus will do. And when you ask what would Jesus do, it's definitely not like that. But I think for Christian, I don't want to judge anyone, right? I don't want I just want to be humble. So in the Romans 8:28, it says, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him and who have been called according to his purpose. So I believe God is so much bigger than I am. And I shouldn't judge, or I shouldn't have an assumption against anything that I don't know. And if I have a question, I'll bring it to him. I will be humble in front of him and letting him to decide. And I'll serve the people and I'll follow Jesus, serve the people as much as I can. That's how I see it.
That's a beautiful definition of politics, serving people and helping to resolve conflicts. That's really helpful.
So I think I come from a divorced family. My parents divorced when I was very little, and they have very different ideology. My dad grew up in US and my mom's grew up in Taiwan. So I live in the environment that with very divided views. There's 9 fruits of spirit, right? And within those fruits, I feel more connected to the fruit of peace. I grew up in this kind of family, divorced family, and I'm always the person trying to bring back the harmony or the become the bridge between my parents. So I feel like that's the mission that God's give me in this world. So I will engage in this society and trying to bring peace and trying to humble myself, understand both sides, and to bring out this peace. But I believe everybody have their own calling. And some people feel more connected to other fruits of the spirit. So I think everybody can engage in politics in different ways. But no matter what, be humble. When you have questions, bring it to God and don't use God's name easily. I think that's something I will always put in my mind.
Don't use God's name easily. I think that's very well said, given how politics has been going, especially in the US, LaRae. I think there are loads of appeals to Christianity over there.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think I like the idea of kind of peacemaking, bridging. And I think, Jasmine, just one more question going along with what you said. You have been very involved in the work of kind of US-Taiwan Watch, and you have other type of work as well, and then you are producing and hosting a podcast on the same topic in the US-Taiwan relations and politics in Taiwan. What type of peacemaking and bridging do you think you as a Christian are doing through this kind of think tank and kind of media work that you do?
Yeah, so I think first of all, I'm helping. So this think tank, we at the same time we are talking to DC people. Also, we are talking to Taiwanese people. So when I'm talking to the audience in DC, I will talk about how the different ideology between Chinese culture and US culture. And I'm not saying that because US should understand China more and then should forgive that China. I'm not talking about that. And I'm not saying that we should build peace like whatever in what circumstances. I'm just trying to let people to understand more of each other. Like I'm helping my mom and my dad to know more of each other and trying to understand their like basic differences so they can better resolve their conflict. And also I'm trying to help US people. US system and Taiwanese system is also very different. US sees Taiwan and how Taiwan sees US is also very different. So even though now we are a good friend, we are allies, but if we want to strengthen these relations, there's a lot of points that we need to resolve, a lot of misunderstanding that we need to resolve. And this is something and for Taiwanese audience, I'm also doing a similar thing, but I sometimes talks about more on the generation gaps because I feel like Taiwanese people sometimes will like young generation or will be too fighty. I don't know if that's a word. So I feel like it's
maybe?
really feisty. Yes. So I think it's I on my podcast, the other co-host, he's more feisty person, and I think that's perfect. We can have a balance, so I will call for people to like try to understand why other generations or why the other party they have the different kind of thinking, because China issue is pretty partisan in Taiwan, and it's also pretty partisan between generations. And I will try my best to let different generations to understand why we think differently. For example, I just mentioned that the education system is different. So I think for younger generation, we shouldn't like blame older generation that you're not saving our country or you abandon Taiwan. I think we need to understand their viewpoint. So that's something I will do and try to bring a harmony for my country.
That's so valuable.
Very meaningful. And I think you're right. I think US-China relations or even China-Taiwan relations, the fact that we have gone down to what we have today, the conflicts, the tensions, the escalating tensions, I think part of it is probably just miscommunication, misunderstanding.
Absolutely. So, as maybe a final question, how can Christians around the world be praying for Taiwan?
Yes, pray for our leaders. Pray for U.S. leaders because U.S. is the biggest allies of Taiwan.
Yes.
And also pray for Xi Jinping.
Yes.
Hope this war will never happen. So I really do hope he's healthy and his people are happy and he can think more for his people. Pray for him. Pray for Taiwan's leader. Pray for future U.S. president. Pray for people in Taiwan, the resilience of the civil society of Taiwan. I think that's the most important.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for coming on, Jasmine. It's been an absolute pleasure to meet you and to have you on our podcast. You've given me personally so many things to think about in terms of how the different education systems in our countries have such long-lasting effects, and just the importance of prayer as we respond as Christians to political turmoil and political disagreements. So I'm sure our listeners have also benefited greatly from your words of wisdom. So thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jasmine. This was such an interesting conversation that we had with you. We learned a lot, and our listeners will probably be intrigued and interested to hear more about religion and politics, and especially religion and politics in Taiwan. And we do have a think tank report coming out in July, so you only have to wait a few more weeks.
Yay!
And then we're going to talk about Taiwanese Christianity and its relationship with politics in Taiwan. And we will talk a little bit more about how pastors in Taiwan responded to the presidential election we had just earlier this year. So if you want to hear more about it, do tune into our future updates.
Thanks for tuning into the Overtones podcast today. Make sure to subscribe and tune in to the next episode on your streaming platform of choice.
Follow us and share our podcast with your friends on Facebook and Instagram. You can find us on both platforms as Overtones Think Tank.
And if you'd like to get in touch with feedback, comments, or other ideas, our email address is podcast@overtonesproject.com. See you next week.